So let's get right into it. The First Crusade. Was it this noble, selfless mission to defend Christendom from a huge threat? Or was it really just a land grab, fueled by greed and ambition, but dressed up in the language of holy war? For centuries, this question has been right at the heart of the Crusade debate. Okay, let's dive into this and unpack one of the most compelling arguments that the First Crusade was, at its core, an act of defense.
And get this quote isn't from 1095, when the Crusade was actually called. Nope, this is Pope Gregory VII, writing more than 20 years before. The language here is, wow. It's stark, it's desperate. It paints this picture of a disaster closing in, a pagan race, he means the Seljuk Turks, just tearing apart the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. This feeling of crisis was already thick in the air in Rome, long before the first Crusader ever packed his bags.
Okay, so this really sets up the central question for us, doesn't it? Was the call to arms a genuine response to this cry for help, a real rescue mission to save their fellow Christians and push back a hostile power? Or were there other, more earthly motivations bubbling just under the surface? Let's take a look at the evidence.
All right, first up, we've got to get a handle on just how bad things were for the Byzantine Empire. And I mean, they were in deep, deep trouble. They were really facing a catastrophic collapse. So the whole crisis really kicks off in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. And look, this wasn't just a loss, it was a total wipeout. The Byzantines lost Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, which was basically their breadbasket and their main source for soldiers. Huge deal. Fast forward to 1081, Alexius Comnenus grabs power, but he's basically fighting fires on all sides. The final straw? 1094. He almost gets overthrown by his own nobles who are screaming at him to get Anatolia back. The guy was totally backed into a corner. His army was shot, so he had to look west for help. And this really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? Look at the difference. In just one generation, the empire goes from this absolute powerhouse on the left to a complete shadow of its former self on the right. We're not talking about a slow, gentle decline here. This was a free fall. It just shows you how crippling that loss of Anatolia was. Without its core lands, the empire was basically bleeding out, and Alexius knew it.
Okay, so with that context, this feeling of absolute crisis, let's build the case for the Crusade as a defensive war. And honestly, the evidence is pretty strong.
Right, so the big thing to remember is that this crusade didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a direct answer to a call for help from Emperor Alexius. And like we saw, the popes in Rome had been hearing the alarm bells for decades. On top of that, you have these horror stories trickling back to Europe about Christian pilgrims being attacked in the Holy Land, like that massacre in Jerusalem in 1077. And finally, having Western knights go fight as mercenaries in the East, that wasn't a new thing. It was already happening. So this whole thing was framed as a relief mission, not some random invasion. And this quote, man, this just captures the sales pitch perfectly. This is an account of what Pope Urban II supposedly said when he called for the crusade. And notice what he's saying. He's not just talking about Jerusalem, he's talking about the kingdom of the Greeks, the Byzantine Empire. The whole mission is framed as taking back what was lost, of avenging wrongs done to their Christian brothers. It's a call to defend, to restore. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? History's never that simple. The defensive argument is solid, but it's not the whole story, not by a long shot. So let's flip the coin and look at how things like ambition, greed, and a very different idea of God's will played a huge, huge role. To really get the other side of this, you have to understand one word, primogeniture. Sounds fancy, but it's simple. In 11th century Europe, all the family land, all the titles, everything went to the oldest son, period. So what about the second, third, fourth sons? Well, they were trained their whole lives to be knights, to be elite fighters, but they had zero inheritance, no land, no future at home. So Europe was just swimming with these hyper-violent, super ambitious young men who were desperate for a way to make a name for themselves.
And this is where you see the gap between the promises and the reality just open right up. Emperor Alexius was no fool. He made all the Crusader leaders swear a solemn oath to return any former Byzantine lands they conquered. The deal was simple. He'd help them with supplies. They'd give him his territory back. But, yeah, that's not quite how it went down. I mean, this table says it all, doesn't it? Look at Bohemond of Taranto, a classic landless younger son. He swore the oath, but the second he captured the huge city of Antioch, he refused to hand it over, kept it for himself, and founded his own little kingdom. Then you've got Baldwin of Bologna, He didn't even hang around that long. He peeled off from the main army to go create his own state at Edessa. Tancred did the same thing. These are not the actions of guys on a simple rescue mission. These guys were entrepreneurs of war, building their own personal empires.
And just think about the cost. Going on crusade was insanely expensive. I mean, 200 ounces of pure gold, that was just a loan to get one lord and his crew to the east. People were mortgaging their lands, their entire futures. You don't take that kind of gamble unless you're expecting a serious return on your investment. And I'm not just talking about spiritual brownie points.
And this wasn't just a problem with the nobility. The so-called People's Crusade, which was this sort of chaotic first wave, shows you how twisted the motives could get. You have guys like Count Emicho leading his followers not to fight the Seljuks, but on a horrific, murderous rampage against Jewish communities in Germany, slaughtering thousands. Why? A terrible mix of religious fanaticism and, as even the chroniclers at the time pointed out, plain old greed.
So how do we square this? How do historians make sense of all these conflicting motives? Was it defense or was it greed? Well, as it usually is with history, the real answer is messy. A perfect example of this is how historians look at Baldwin taking Edessa. For a long, long time, the traditional view from historians like Stephen Runciman was that this was just pure, naked ambition. Baldwin was a younger son, he wanted land, he took it. Simple. But more recently, historians like Thomas Asbridge have said, hang on a second. Maybe it was actually a brilliant military strategy, a planned move to protect the supply lines for the main army before the giant siege of Antioch. So, was it greed or was it strategy? The truth is, it could easily have been both at the same time. So, at the end of the day, you have to accept that this was just a complex web of motives. For sure, some people had genuine personal piety. They truly wanted their sins forgiven and to free Jerusalem. For Pope Urban, it was a genius geopolitical move to boost his own power. For society back in Europe, it was a great way to ship its most violent guys overseas. And for those violent guys, it was the chance of a lifetime to get land, titles, and a whole lot of plunder. None of these reasons cancels out the others. They all existed at once. And you know what's really interesting? People at the time saw this mix of motives clear as day. The chronicler Albert of Aix, writing about those massacres of Jewish people, he didn't pull any punches. He basically said the Crusaders were motivated more by greed for money than by divine justice. They understood, even then, that sacred goals and worldly desires could get all tangled up. So let's circle back. Was the First Crusade a defensive war? The answer has to be, yeah, kind of. But also, no, not really. It absolutely started as a response to a very real cry for help from the Byzantine Empire, but it was immediately hijacked by 1,000 other ambitions. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. The Crusaders, whether they were fighting for God, for gold, or for glory, almost certainly believed that God was on their side, that what they were doing was right. So how does that fact, that deep, genuine self-belief, change the way we should judge their motives, all these centuries later?